In this final lesson on the USA from 1890 to 1920, we're going to just essentially look at the position of the United States by 1920. This is the final part of Chapter 2 on our specification, which asks us to examine what the USA was like by 1920, looking at the economic situation, looking at the social and ethnic divisions, and looking at the political reaction of renewed isolationism. And so, essentially, as we move into the 1920s, the so-called Roaring Twenties, and then we start looking at things like the Wall Street crash, the New Deal, the Great Depression, and then the Second World War, we'll start to see how the United States shifts and emerges into history as a superpower. And that's what the two chapters that we've got left to cover essentially are going to be examining. The first is going to be looking at the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and the Second World War, the crisis of identity from 1920 to 1945. And then finally, we will talk about the US for the majority of the Cold War as it emerges as a superpower from 1945 to 1975. So, the First World War would end in 1918, and it ends with a victory for Great Britain, France, and the United States. Now, Woodrow Wilson, who has been pictured at the top of this screen for the last few lessons, was heavily involved in European politics and European geopolitics for the period immediately following the end of the First World War. So he essentially tried to issue a decree for what he believed to be the points of involvement for the peace process, which became known as his 14 points. So the Wilson administration remained very heavily involved in European geopolitics during this time. They also had a very heavy hand when it came to involvement in the peace process as well as the eventual armistice. In fact, it was the German Empire who surrendered or offered armistice to the United States rather than to Britain and to France, seeing that the United States would probably issue much fonder, more favourable terms than the two countries that have been at war from the very beginning. The US would also be present at the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles essentially was a treaty which ultimately led to agreements on what would happen after the First World War, what would happen to Germany after the First World War, and what would happen to the international order, the international global order of states. So the Treaty of Versailles came with it the creation of what was known as the League of Nations. The League of Nations is seen to be something of a precursor to what we have today, which is obviously the United Nations. The League of Nations would ultimately fail in the 1930s when it failed to prevent a number of major geopolitical issues, such as the German invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Soviet invasion of Finland, the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, all of which leads to the Second World War eventually devolving with the German invasion of Poland. Now, in terms of the United States' involvement in all of this, Woodrow Wilson's administration, like I said, is heavily involved in the post-war immediate armistice, peace process, and creation of the League of Nations. He issues his 14 points. He is very heavily involved in this peace process. But when he goes back to the United States to try and encourage the US to join the League of Nations, Congress would veto US involvement in the League of Nations. Essentially, this means that the US would remain neutral and remain out of the affairs of international politics. This leads to a situation known as renewed isolationism. This renewed isolationism would continue until the US involvement in the Second World War in 1941. Now, there's sort of an increased interventionism when we talk about the start of the Second World War, when we talk about their funding of the Soviet Union in addition to their funding of Great Britain between 1939 and 1941. But really, the end of this renewed isolationism begins at the point at which the US are formally involved and invoked their involvement in the Second World War in December 1941. So for the period of the 1920s and the 1930s, you get the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. Or this time, there is very limited involvement in international politics and international affairs on the part of the United States. Now, when it comes to the economy and how the economy looked and fared at the end of the First World War, despite being part of the First World War, the US came out of it as one of the most prominent superpowers economically. This is partially due to the fact that the United States has a very unique position in the world, both geographically in terms of the fact that they're never going to have to deal with the issue of reconstruction and reconstructing their own state, because no one's really going to be ever fighting a war on US soil, touch wood, especially during the First World War, because they could not reach them. There's the Atlantic on one side and the Pacific on the other. And so the task of reconstructing, just like there was a task of reconstructing Europe after the end of the First and the Second World Wars, that is a task that the US didn't have to deal with. The US also have incredible industrial capacity and the capacity to mobilize industry incredibly effectively, which meant that at the end of both the First and the Second World War, the United States comes out of it as the most prominent economic superpowers at the time. It had lent billions of dollars to the Allied powers up to the year of 1917, and so it was owed up to $2.25 billion by the end of the war. So not only did it barely spend too much in terms of actually being involved in the war directly, it didn't have to reconstruct in terms of its war effort and damage that was caused to the United States, but it was then also owed billions by the Allies, and then it was owed revenue by Germany when it came to reparations payments from the Treaty of Versailles. So all of which meant that the US was in a very strong economic position at the end of the First World War. Their war effort led to a massive expansion in their industrial capacity, overtaking all of the European powers, including overtaking Germany. A similar thing happens at the end of the Second World War with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union industrializes quite significantly during the 1920s, well, after the 1920s really, because they have a civil war to fight, during the 1930s and into the early 1940s, owing to Stalin's 5-year plans and collectivization policies. But it is the Second World War and their capability to industrialize at a rapid pace that really lends a situation to which they come out of the end of the Second World War as a major superpower, just like the United States. So as I mentioned, the US not having to directly involve themselves by way of their territory contributed to the strengthening of their economic position. They didn't have to defend their borders. They didn't have to reconstruct any of their cities in the same way that Germany, France, and Great Britain had to do in the First and Second World Wars. And given the US' strong position as a global economy, they became a more reliable source of finance than that of Great Britain, France, and Germany. So then they then were able to you could then rely upon the United States when it came to the lending of loans, something that the Germans would ultimately do in paying reparations, which would all of these things would come back to bite them in the end of the 1920s when the Wall Street crash happens, which we will get to, I promise. Finally then, what about the social position of the United States by the end of the 1920s? By 1920 specifically, should I say? Well, it had the First World War did have quite significant social impacts on the United States. Firstly, the First World War brought about a major shift in the migration of people into urban environments, the Great Migration, as we mentioned in the previous lesson. This involved a major influx of African Americans north into major cities. This would then cause quite significant tensions with the more urban environments. There was still racial division, there was still racial segregation quite significantly during this time, and the movement of African Americans into the cities exacerbated racial tensions. A key example of this is the riots of East St. Louis of 1917, probably more accurately described as a massacre. This is where thousands of white demonstrators would consistently and ultimately terrorize a number of black victims, killing 39. There are events that take place in history that we label massacres where there are less deaths than this, so you probably would accurately describe this as a massacre. Another example of this is the Washington race riots of 1919. If you want to know more, go Google the Washington race riots to see just how bad these were. Race and racial tensions, while always have been front and center of US political and social struggles, becomes increasingly more problematic as we go deeper into the 20th century. Especially the end of the Second World War, when African Americans who contributed significantly to the war effort then begin to want to seek further racial equality, we start to see the groundworks being laid for the establishment of the civil rights movement, which goes all the way into the 1960s. So race and race relations will begin to play an increasingly more significant role in our studies and on the sort of political and social structures of the United States as we get deeper and deeper into the 1960s.